Hello, it's Dr. Cindy with this week's Mental Health Moment. Today I'm going to talk about communication. And we tend to think of communication as a two-part process. One person speaks, the other listens, and a message is delivered and received. But it is actually more complicated than that. In any exchange between two people, there are four parts: what the speaker is trying to say, what the speaker actually says, what the listener hears, and then how the listener interprets it. That means that within each effort to communicate, there are four opportunities for things to go awry. Let me give you a simple example. Many years ago, I was visiting my father and stepmother in Florida. My father and I were talking about watching the Yukon women's basketball team in their championship game that night, and we decided we would order pizza for dinner to make things easy. And my stepmother wasn't in the room at the time, but I didn't give that a second thought. When evening came around, I said to my father, "The boys are probably going to need to eat soon," meaning that we should go ahead and place the pizza order. But the next thing I knew, my stepmother was in the kitchen cooking because she interpreted my statement as me wanting dinner to be made. Luckily, that was a situation in which it was obvious a miscommunication had occurred and the error could be easily corrected. But many times, the glitches in our conversations with one another are not so straightforward or readily apparent. We all take shortcuts in our communication with each other, and the more we know the other person, the more we tend to take those shortcuts because of the assumption that there is a shared mutual understanding between us, a common language, if you will. And to some extent, these shortcuts are necessary. If everything we said always had to be spelled out in complete specificity and detail, that would be incredibly inefficient and unwieldy. So we rely on our shared vocabulary to impart shared meaning. But just because we speak the same words does not mean that we automatically have mutual understanding. A man I know is overseeing a young college student who is doing some cleaning for him over the summer at his church. The student asked if there was anything else he should do before he proceeded to finish up for the day. The man said, "Why don't you go around that room with the vacuum?" Well, the student then went and followed through with the instructions by literally taking the vacuum cleaner and walking around the room with it. The man then had to specify that he meant the student should plug in the cord, turn on the machine, and actually vacuum the carpet. Miscommunications like that are amusing and fairly harmless when it's evident that there's been a misunderstanding. That gives the speaker the opportunity to clarify what was meant, and the communication can be successfully completed. But what if the man hadn't checked on his employee right then and went into the room later in the day to discover it hadn't been vacuumed? He might then have assumed that his request was ignored, and that could have adversely affected his view of the student worker. Or in the case of my stepmother, if I had left to get the pizza and wasn't present to see her starting to cook, I would have come home to find an entire meal made. And she might have felt really taken for granted or imposed upon because she thought I expected her to cook for my children. There are some common pitfalls with communication that can cause or contribute to challenges between people, and some strategies for facilitating effective communication. Today, I'm going to focus on the speaker side of communication, which entails figuring out what you want to say and the best way to say it. It is important to look at both of these because a message is only effective if it successfully communicates the intended information. In the example above, my comment about my son's needing to eat dinner soon was not effective because it did not communicate the intended information. A more accurate and clear statement would have been, "I think we should order the pizza soon." So when you are preparing to speak to someone else, you might start by asking yourself, what do I want this person to know? That can help you focus on the bottom line message you hope to communicate, which can then inform what words you end up using in your message. In general, clear and direct works better than vague and indirect. A silly example of this is when someone says, "Do you want to help me with this?" Now, the intended communication is a request for help, but that statement comes across more like an informal survey. And if the recipient answers, no thanks, well, then what? As you practice this, I would encourage you to assume that the first thing that comes to mind when you ask yourself what you want the other person to know may not be the true message and therefore won't yield the most appropriate or effective language to use. So whatever that first thought is, explore what's below it. For example, if you decide to talk to your son about leaving the toilet seat up, and you contemplate what you want him to know, your first thought might be, I want him to know he left the toilet seat up. But if you think about that further, is that what you really want him to know? First of all, chances are he already knows, so you're not really imparting useful information by telling him. If he happens not to know, he probably doesn't really care to know. If you look at the deeper message you want to convey, it is probably more along the lines of wanting him to know that it bothers you when he leaves the toilet seat up, or asking him to try to be more conscientious about putting it down. In the case of a challenging interpersonal situation, it is especially important to take the time to figure out what you want to convey to the other person. Some of the most difficult conversations we have are those in which one person is upset with the other. When someone has done something that we're upset about, we generally want them to know how we feel. But because many people struggle to understand and talk about their own emotions, that type of communication often is not very direct or clear. And because strong emotions interfere with rational thought, it is always important to first tend to the difficult feelings before you attempt to communicate about them. Additionally, remember that our minds look to assign blame when problematic situations occur. So what we are inclined to say is often focused on the other person's behavior instead of our feelings about it. That typically leads to the other person feeling accused, judged, criticized, or even attacked, which creates defensiveness on their part and poses a barrier to the intended message being received. When we are mindful of the fact that many of our challenging reactions are due to the interactions between what the other person did and the sensitivity it touches in us, we can more effectively communicate about our own emotional reaction rather than the other person's action. You all know the expression, keep it simple, stupid. I suggest when it comes to communication, you keep it simple, short, and self-focused. Keeping it simple means really trying to get down to that bottom line message, the essence of what you want the person to know. Keeping it short means delivering your point as succinctly as possible. Think of it as a bumper sticker. It's your opening line that gets across the point you're trying to make. So begin the conversation with that. Don't give an entire backstory or a preamble leading up to the main message. That dilutes the message because it gets lost within the rest of the verbiage, and you lose your audience in the process. Also avoid following your message with examples or information to back it up. That comes across as a lecture or like you're trying to present your case, and you will likely lose your audience that way as well. When we speak with the goal of trying to get someone to agree with us, we are not communicating, we are convincing. People naturally resist when they feel someone is trying to impose their views on them, and no one likes to be talked at. So whatever your main point is, say it and then let the other person respond. That's really what a conversation should be, a back and forth exchange of thoughts, ideas, and feelings between people. Keeping it self-focused has to do with the second part of speaking, which is how to verbalize what you're actually trying to say. I encourage people to start with I statements. No, there's no app for that on the iPhone, although I certainly have thought about developing one. I statements essentially entail framing comments with a focus on yourself rather than on the person you're talking to. A simple example of this would be saying, I felt hurt when you, rather than saying, you hurt me when you. By framing the statement based on your own feelings rather than the other person's actions, it comes across as a desire to communicate how those actions affected you. Remember, that is the intended purpose, instead of an accusation that they've done something wrong. This will hopefully facilitate the other person being able to hear and receive the message. Imagine each of these statements being said to you and notice the difference in how you feel. You're late. I'm upset that you're late. You left your dirty dishes in the sink. I'm frustrated that you left your dirty dishes in the sink. You never called me back. I felt hurt that you didn't call me back. Being on the receiving end of any of those statements that start with you would naturally cause someone to feel defensive and guarded. When we lead the conversation with a statement about our own feelings, that puts the emphasis on ourselves rather than on the other person. Of course, how we frame the second half of the sentence is also important. Saying, I feel angry when you act like a jerk, will still create defensiveness in the other person. Effective communication also involves sticking with the immediate issue when discussing a concern, rather than making global, sweeping generalizations about the challenging dynamic. Even if the particular behavior has happened before, it is better to try to focus on the specific here and now incident. As part of this, using words like always and never should be avoided. I know of very few scenarios in which a person truly always or never acts in a particular way 100% of the time. So using those words will immediately make someone feel unfairly criticized and judged, and they can easily dismiss your entire statement as being false as soon as they come up with even one example of a time that they didn't commit or omit the act that you're talking to them about. Tell your teenager that he always leaves the toilet seat up, and he will jump at the chance to tell you that he remembers putting it down just last night. Thank you very much. Along those same lines, it is also important to try not to bring in more examples of a person's other misdeeds. We call this kitchen sinking, when people bring up anything and everything they can think of that they've ever been upset with each other about. Now, when you refer to past behaviors as parts of the conversation about a current one, you open the door for the other person to bring up things from the past about you as well. And if you're not careful, you can easily find yourselves rehashing an argument from 5 years ago and becoming completely sidetracked from the initial issue. Couples seem to have a particular affinity for this. We've talked a lot about how interactions between people are affected by the mindset or template that they impose on their encounters with others. We can minimize this happening by establishing an environment that feels safe and non-threatening. The most effective and collaborative communication happens when both parties are open and receptive. Each person only has responsibility for her or his part in the communication. We can't control how others will interpret, react to, receive what we say. All we can do is work toward making our side of the conversation as clear and non-judgmental as possible. That brings me to expectations around communication. If you are feeling upset about something another person said or did, the goal of communicating that to them is twofold: an expression of a difficult emotion for your benefit, and providing information about you to the other person for the benefit of your relationship with them. Expressing your difficult feeling helps you because it can hopefully enable you to not stay stuck in the emotional pain of the situation, and can facilitate its resolution so the incident does not get stored away as a grievance. That obviously also has a secondary benefit for the relationship, because as the fewer grievances you hold against them, the more positive and connected that relationship can be. Additionally, providing information to the other person about how their behavior affects you is beneficial because it gives him or her an awareness of what things matter to you and have an emotional impact on you. What may seem obvious to us as a bothersome behavior isn't necessarily obvious to someone else, so they can't know unless we tell them. And if the situation were reversed and you did something that upset someone you care about, you would want to know that so you could be mindful of it in the future. Now note that I didn't say the goal is to change the other person's behavior. It is not our job to change another person, only to inform him or her about things that bother or upset us in our interactions with them. What the other person chooses to do with the information is completely up to them. When we put ourselves in charge of trying to change the other person, we are automatically focused on trying to make them see that they are wrong in some way. That is no longer an environment that fosters openness and receptiveness, but one in which the other person will naturally feel accused or even attacked, and will respond by defending themselves and accusing or attacking back. Labeling a person or their behavior will also cause them to feel accused and attacked. If someone is doing something that feels hurtful, say, "That feels hurtful," rather than "You're being abusive." Other words that tend to cause defensiveness and resistance are why and should and shouldn't. Why makes people feel questioned, and should or shouldn't makes them feel judged and criticized. Remember, the point is to communicate how you are feeling about the upsetting behavior, not to confront, criticize, shame, or blame the other person about the behavior. This can be especially challenging to do if the person's initial response to your I statement comes across in a way that dismisses your concern, minimizes the behavior, or otherwise detracts or deflects from the message you are trying to communicate. Let's take the "I'm upset that you're late" comment. Ideally, the person would respond by acknowledging what happened and apologizing for upsetting you. Like, "I know, I'm so sorry, that was inconsiderate of me." But more commonly, the response might be something along the lines of, "Well, traffic was really bad," which sounds like an excuse or an explanation. "I'm only 10 minutes late," which is minimizing. Or, "Well, that's not worth being upset about," which is dismissing the feeling. When our I statements are met with some type of pushback, it is very tempting to react with comments that judge, scold, or catalog the person's transgressions. As compelling as that is, it is very important to try to resist that reflex and stick with talking about yourself instead of focusing on the other person. An appropriate response to any defending, dismissing, or deflecting reaction could simply be, "I wanted to tell you how I'm feeling because our relationship is important to me." That has far more potential to help the other person be receptive to what you're trying to say than if you proceed to list the past 10 times that they've been late. Next week, we'll talk about the equally important but frequently overlooked second part of communication, which has to do with listening. Take care, and I'll see you then. Have a good week.